There was no flopping and flailing, such as old Toot Toot had done at rehearsal, only that powerful forward surge, as a man may surge forward from the hips while in the grip of a powerful orgasm. The chief's blue shirt pulled tight at the buttons, creating little strange smiles of flesh between them. And there was a smell. Not bad in itself, but unpleasant in its associations. I've never been able to go down in the cellar at my granddaughter's house when they bring me there, although that's where their little boy has his Lionel set up, which he would dearly love to share with his great-grandpa. I don't mind the trains, as I'm sure you can guess, it's the transformer I can't abide. The way it hums. And the way, when it gets hot, it smells. Even after all these years, that smell reminds me of Cold Mountain. Van Hay gave him 30 seconds, then turned the juice off. The doctor stepped forward from his place and listened with his stethoscope. There was no talk from the witnesses now. The doctor straightened up and looked through the mesh. "Disorganized," he said, and made a twirling, cranking gesture with one finger. He had heard a few random heartbeats from Bitterbuck's chest, probably as meaningless as the final jitters of a decapitated chicken, but it was better not to take chances. You didn't want him suddenly sitting up on the gurney when you had him halfway through the tunnel, bawling that he felt like he was on fire. Van Hay rolled on 3 and the chief surged forward again, twisting a little from side to side in the grip of the current. When Doc listened this time, he nodded. It was over. We had once again succeeded in destroying what we could not create. Some of the folks in the audience had begun talking in those low voices again, most sat with their heads down, looking at the floor, as if stunned. Or ashamed. Harry and Dean came up with the stretcher. It was actually Percy's job to take one end, but he didn't know and no one had bothered to tell him. The chief, still wearing the black silk hood, was loaded onto it by Brutal and me, and we whisked him through the door which led to the tunnel as fast as we could manage it without actually running. Smoke, too much of it, was rising from the hole in the top of the mask, and there was a horrible stench. "Aw, man!" Percy cried, his voice wavering. "What's that smell?" "Just get out of my way and stay out of it," Brutal said, shoving past him to get to the wall where there was a mounted fire extinguisher. It was one of the old chemical kind that you had to pump. Dean, meanwhile, had stripped off the hood. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. Bitterbuck's left braid was smoldering like a pile of wet leaves. Never mind that thing, I told Brutal. I didn't want to have to clean a load of chemical slime off the dead man's face before putting him in the back of the meat wagon. I slapped at the chief's head, Percy staring at me, wide-eyed, the whole time, until the smoke quit rising. Then we carried the body down the 12 wooden steps to the tunnel. Here it was as chilly and dank as a dungeon, with the hollow plink-plink sound of dripping water. Hanging lights with crude tin shades, they were made in the prison machine shop, showed a brick tube that ran 30 feet under the highway. The top was curved and wet. It made me feel like a character in an Edgar Allan Poe story every time I used it. There was a gurney waiting. We loaded Bitterbuck's body onto it, and I made a final check to make sure his hair was out. That one braid was pretty well charred, and I was sorry to see that the cunning little bow on that side of his head was now nothing but a blackened lump. Percy slapped the dead man's cheek. The flat smacking sound of his hand made us all jump. Percy looked around at us with a cocky smile on his mouth, eyes glittering. Then he looked back at Bitterbuck again. "Adios, Chief," he said. "Hope hell's hot enough for you." "Don't do that," Brutal said, his voice hollow and declamatory in the dripping tunnel. "He's paid what he owed. He's square with the house again. You keep your hands off him." "Aw, blow it out," Percy said, but he stepped back uneasily when Brutal moved toward him, shadow rising behind him like the shadow of that ape in the story about the Rue Morgue. But instead of grabbing at Percy, Brutal grabbed hold of the gurney and began pushing Arlen Bitterbuck slowly toward the far end of the tunnel, where his last ride was waiting, parked on the soft shoulder of the highway. The gurney's hard rubber wheels moaned on the boards, its shadow rode the bulging brick wall, waxing and waning. Dean and Harry grasped the sheet at the foot and pulled it up over the chief's face, which had already begun to take on the waxy, characterless cast of all dead faces, the innocent as well as the guilty. 6. When I was 18, my Uncle Paul, the man I was named for, died of a heart attack. My mother and dad took me to Chicago with them to attend his funeral and visit relatives from my father's side of the family, many of whom I had never met. We were gone almost a month. In some ways that was a good trip, a necessary and exciting trip, but in another way it was horrible. I was deeply in love, you see, with the young woman who was to become my wife 2 weeks after my 19th birthday.